Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to a special 5-part podcast series on the impacts of emerging regulations on supply chain compliance. This series is sponsored by Ascent Compliance. Ascent Compliance provides cloud-based SaaS solutions that help companies manage their supply chain data, facilitate stakeholder and supply chain education on regulatory and program requirements, and increase transparency between businesses. Ascent helps companies overcome the challenge of meeting their compliance business requirements. Finally, Ascent streamlines the data exchange process for suppliers, making it easier for them to comply with their customers' data requests. For more information, check out their website, ascentcompliance.com. In this special 5-part podcast series, I visit with several members of the Ascent team to take a look at this topic, review human trafficking and slavery developments, supply chain risk management programs, CSR value propositions, the current state of responsible mineral sourcing, and scaling up to meet challenges today, tomorrow, and down the road. It's a fascinating series that I know you will enjoy. In this 5th and final episode, I visit with Jonathan Hughes, and we wrap up this podcast series by talking about scaling up in your compliance program through robust technology. I know you'll enjoy it. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and we are back for our concluding episode in our 5-part series on impacts of emerging regulations. Today, I have with me Jonathan Hughes. He is the Director of Strategic Relationships at Ascent Compliance. So, Jonathan, first of all, thank you for taking the time to visit with me today, and welcome.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me on. Thank you for having me on here.
Jonathan, many compliance practitioners have struggled with not so much simply technology, but also what are the benefits that technology brings. And so I wanted to start off by asking you, there has been, certainly from my perspective, a surge in companies utilizing third-party compliance platforms. And I wanted your thoughts on why that happens, but really the broader questions of what does that bring to the compliance practitioner more than just efficiency? What type of information can they use on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. No, absolutely. That's a good question. And that's certainly something that we've been seeing in the market as well. And it's starting to grow at an exponential pace, right? So if you look at the number and types of companies that were adopting third-party solutions 5 years ago, it just keeps on snowballing, becoming more and more each year, more and more companies are adopting that. And I think it plays into each other. The more companies that adopt it, they push down through, governance and requests to their suppliers and so on and so forth. More and more companies then need to adopt those programs. But I think at its heart, it has to do with the regulations themselves. So, as any compliance officer, I'm sure would tell you within the first few minutes of meeting them, regulations are becoming more prevalent and more complex. And so what that means is if you look at the number of regulations on the book that a compliance officer had to deal with 10 years ago compared to 5 years ago, even compared to 2 years ago, and so on, and then look at the number of new regulations that are being, promulgated and planned over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, it really is quite staggering. And another item is that these regulations are dynamic. And what that means is that a lot of these regulations, when they're pushed out now, have room in them to change over time. So you can imagine if you're a compliance officer, that really presents you with, 3 different types of challenges. So number one, just with the depth of and complexity and the volume of that information, the regulatory knowledge that you need to be a compliance officer is literally doubled in the last 5 years, right? If you were trying to be a jack of all trades or even going into different specialties. And, with that knowledge and with these increased amount of data means that there's more data requirements. So when there's more regulations, you need more data, more proof, more evidence to demonstrate that you comply with these regulations, right? So they kind of tie into each other. So now, not only your compliance officers have an increased burden, everything to do with the data has an increased burden. How do we capture this data? How do we measure this data? How do we verify this data? And then those two items have also led to a third item, which I see as driving more companies to utilize third-party platforms, is you need processes and you need governance for this data. So because there's all of these new regulations, you need to have people that are up to speed. Because these regulations you're putting in requirements on more data requirements on your supply chains and other areas, right? That leads to, more complexity and burden on your internal programs. And these lead to the need for more processes and governance. So when you add these three things up, that's why we see, at least in our opinion and our experience, a lot of companies kind of looking around and saying, okay, we need to go find a third party who's kind of dedicated to this, who can keep their eyes on it for us.
You really packed a lot into there, Jonathan. If I could even go back to one of our earlier podcasts I did with Kate Dunbar, where she gave me the statistic that since 2015, there have been three major human trafficking anti-slavery laws passed worldwide. So that's, since that time, that's 12, and she sees that continue to go forward. And that's just one small piece of supply chain compliance. That doesn't even speak to the regulations that you were talking about. Yeah.
No, absolutely. That's quite right. And it's actually more prevalent if you start going into things like product compliance and material restrictions. Let alone there's a whole, wealth of other compliance topics that we don't even particularly deal with that are seeing the same kind of burdens increase on them. And so, Kate obviously has a good point that's her expertise. And when each of these, new rules and regulations come out, it can be quite the burden to a compliance officer, when they already had a full-time job, okay, and then they've gotten three new regulations to deal with. It's just becoming quite taxing on them internally.
Jonathan, I don't know what your perspective might be north of the border, but down here south of the border, we think about trade compliance literally on an hourly basis under the current administration, the way things change. And what was acceptable as a supply chain practice may not be acceptable today, literally. So I was wondering, how can a company like Ascent help a supply chain professional manage not only their internal portfolio, but manage this continuing change in the regulatory framework that can occur literally on a 24-hour basis? What's the advantage of having this based on a tech solution?
Yeah, and absolutely, that's a great question. And this is something that we wrestled with on another side of our business, not the trade compliance side, specifically in material restrictions, where you have this moving yardstick, right, and moving the goalposts every 6 months. We need to be here. We need to be here. This substance good. This substance is bad. It's allowed. It's banned. And so we did try a number of different ways to tackle this problem, but the only problem that we found to be effective was building configurability and scalability into our software. And so what that means is once you have a set of configurable rules and processes and workflow that can be applied to any type of restriction and change, then you don't have to worry about those restrictions and changes, right? You can just to tweak your system as needed. And that's kind of the approach that our clients who use our platform have taken to these different types of trade compliance changes that obviously, as you said, we're seeing in almost real time today. And so what that means effectively for a supply chain professional is that when you partner with, a third-party solution or someone like Ascent, you want to make sure that it is scalable, that it is configurable, so that when a change comes out, you're not having to go back to the vendor, get a customization, getting a work order, getting a purchase order, getting IT and dev, et cetera. Takes you, 6 months to a year. And by that time, it's changed again several times. And so from the ground up, we made sure that our platform, we want to be almost rule agnostic so that, our system, while we do have everything out of the box to comply with today's existing rules, that all of these items and the workflows and the rules can be adapted on the fly quickly and easily by the user so that we can adapt in real time. And, it's very fortuitous to us that we prepared to do this in one space, that we're now seeing this, the current administration seeing this happening in another place like trade compliance, and we can take those set of features and configurability and scalability and apply it to another solution. And that's kind of the overall benefit of being on a platform like Ascent, because we have all these wide range of sets and features, we can often apply them to a various amount of different, supply chain and compliance issues.
Jonathan, once again, just a ton of information in those comments. I'm going to try and unpack one very small part, which is
Yeah.
the economies of scale, but more importantly, the ability to scale up. I
Yes.
talk to a lot of entrepreneurs, and they say one of their greatest challenges is what do you put in place that allows you to scale up, not painlessly, because it's never going to be painlessly, but with as little friction as possible. And it seems like to me, you guys have brought that insight to the what started as a legal or regulatory response in terms of compliance, but really now is a business process. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're quite right.
So let me
So
turn.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, let me turn just a little bit to ask you a couple of questions about what have you seen or what has Ascent seen in terms of the dangers to companies for noncompliance, either from the regulatory / government perspective, but from where I look at it, really from the reputational perspective, the customer relations perspective, or even their own employees' perspective.
Yeah, no, so absolutely. And so whenever we look at this, there's two different types of risks, right? So now there's your obvious types, your brand awareness. Okay, you obviously don't want your brand to be associated with any of these kinds of, CSR issues in your supply chain, whether it be, slave labor, conflict minerals, what have you. You don't want your brand tied to that in any way, shape, or form. And so that's kind of one level. Tied closely to that is customer risk. So you don't want your customers to come back to you and say that the data that you've provided on a specific compliance topic is not sufficient to meet their standards, and so that they're going to, discontinue doing business with you. So that is a very real risk. It's something that we're seeing more and more come about today. I think everyone would all agree that today's consumers, especially younger consumers, are more socially aware. And, a lot of that is not so much, people 50 years ago weren't socially aware. We didn't have the data, right? I mean, you didn't have a 24/7 stream of social media, Wikipedia, Twitter, and what have you to bring these types of issues to light in real time. Right. And so I don't think it's something that's necessarily, I don't think being socially conscious is new to humanity. I think the ability for people to understand these problems in real time with a depth that we haven't seen, due to the internet and social media and other pieces of technology, that's what's changed, right? People haven't changed. So, when you have these different technologies that are going to allow consumers to make more informed choices, they will make a more informed choice. And I think that that's really led to this, as you've seen kind of an explosion of companies being interested in CSR and ESG issues. So that's one piece, okay, and that's the brand risk, business risk. But, there's another risk that we talk about, less talked about, but, when people say, all right, well, why should I do this? Why can't I just continue doing what I'm doing, right? Well, and it's not as if companies typically, if they know about a requirement, it's not that they won't do anything, right? It's not like they're literally going to make a conscious decision and say, I'm going to do nothing. Quite often what happens is, and this ties into the first question that you talked about. So, 10 years ago, I had a program to deal with compliance. And it's almost like boiling a frog or something where, slowly over the years, these requirements have gotten ratcheted up, more complex. They've added more. 10 years later, there's 10 times the regulations, but they haven't really upgraded their compliance team. Right? They haven't, increased the compliance team, increased that budget. And so a lot of companies just keep these same teams and just pile on more requests. And they think that because they did, the way they did compliance, 10 years ago that they can do today. And that's the real risk. And what we often find, especially when we dive in, is that, a lot of times people are having a hard time quantifying what they do for compliance. Because what happens is, if you're a compliance officer, a supply chain professional, and you're getting all of these different requests, if you're not given budget or resources to tackle them, you have to start relying on other companies. So it becomes this, there's this interdepartmental cost burden that quite often isn't recognized. So, whether it's leaning on people in admin to, deal with email sendouts and, tabulating reports, or dealing with people in procurement to deal with suppliers, or dealing with people in legal to answer questions about changing regulations, dealing with people in engineering to answer questions about your products, people in, sales to ask questions about, messaging. So quite often the compliance, when you look at the top line budget, okay, I've got some people in my compliance department, but when you start to dig deeper when you look at the kind of internal risk, the program's held together by, the duct tape and some gum. And just, there's a lot of different supporting resources that aren't typically counted towards that program that are almost in every case actually helping. So as far as the risk goes to companies today, I think the risk is obvious about noncompliance. It's not going away. It's only going to become more prevalent as consumers continue to have more information that allows them to be a more socially conscious consumer. But then internally as well, and this especially goes for companies that aren't necessarily B2C companies, right, who wouldn't say nobody doesn't care about their brand, but they're not as brand sensitive as a Nike. Well, your risk of continuing to do business the way you are today, if you haven't updated your compliance program in 5 years, and then you go have a look at how many new regulations and requirements have put on, obviously you're either cutting corners or you're probably using a wealth of internal resources that probably you're not counting.
Jonathan, one of the things that I hear quite a bit is, well, let me back up. If you and I speak and have this conversation, or you and I speak and have a podcast recording like we're doing now, and it goes out to supply chain professionals, they understand it, they get it. But the question I get is, how do I take not simply the passion and enthusiasm that you generate and Ascent generates and the information we can give them and take that to their senior management so that they can gain executive buy-in literally within the four walls of their organization? When faced with that sort of situation or that question, what do you advise?
It's fair, other than bringing me on site. No, it's okay. No, that's obviously a good question. And so, for providers like Ascent and others, we typically have different types of content that they can bring. But if you need to do this on your own, what I would recommend is you don't want your especially senior management to be drinking from a fire hose. So you want to pick one or two causes, regulations, issues, and really explain to them. Don't explain to them, here's the problem, here's the solution, right? You need to explain to senior management, here's the problem, and here's what's going to happen if we don't do anything, right? And because they really need to understand the potential repercussions of what continuing status quo or doing nothing is, as opposed to, here's the regulation, I need to go hire someone, go give me some budget. Right. I think the most successful approaches I've seen internally organizations is explaining why there's an issue and really a little bit of a history of how you came to this point and what's going to happen if we don't do anything. Right. Because until you get buy-in from senior management on that risk and they recognize that, yes, this is a bad thing to continue that way. If you start arguing about resources and budget, they're not going to be able to understand what a good budget is if they don't understand what the repercussions are of not putting anything into place.
Jonathan, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time. This has just been a fascinating exploration with you. Look forward to continuing the conversation down the road. All
right. Thank you very much, Tom. You have a great day.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Impacts of Emerging Regulations on Supply Chain Compliance. I hope you join us again tomorrow for our next episode. This podcast series is sponsored by Ascent Compliance. You can learn more about Ascent Compliance by checking out their website, www.ascentcompliance.com. This special 5-part podcast series has been a special presentation of the Compliance Podcast Network.